Hello viewers, the title of the module which is going to be presented by me is Public Policy, Problems, Proposals and Agenda. Objectives. The objective of this unit is to discuss the public policy problems, proposals and identify the alternatives. Introduction. Over the years since the 1950s, there had been mounting evidence of policy failures in most developing countries. The widely accepted view documented in numerous international, regional and national studies and evaluations is that implementing machinery is a critical factor in determining the achievement of policy goals. Since the 1970s, there has been an awakening to the crucial need to focus on the policy implementation, that is, to close the so-called implementation gap. The central problem then is the identification of factors or variables which impede the policy implementation process. In the context of a policy, implementation is the carrying out of a basic policy decision. It is not self-executing. The implementation phase, faced with numerous problems in the form of a series of mundane decisions and interactions, remained unworthy of the attention of scholars and policy makers. There is the general neglect of the issues with regard to the theory and practice of implementation. Effective implementation requires a chain of command and a capacity to coordinate and control, which are sadly lacking in the implementation of public policies in a developing country like India. Problems in the implementation of policy are common in all countries, be they developed or developing. Many administrative constraints or obstacles to policy implementation have been identified. Conceptual problems, weak coordination among government entities, poor budgeting and financial administration, lack of depth in technically competent personnel, duplication of planning functions, low participation of implementers, over centralization, insufficiency of time, material and infrastructure, poor reporting and feedback mechanism, lack of political will and so on. The problems of policy implementation may be discussed under the following headings. Starting with the conceptual problems. Policy analysis preoccupied with the implementation see failure or problems in implementation from conceptual point of view. These analysts argue that implementation of public policies has been hindered by conceptual problems in understanding the nature of contextual problems and the kinds of policies and procedures necessary to address these problems. These conceptual problems may be related to policy design and policy analysis. Policy design. Hogwood and Gunn argued that the chances of a successful outcome will be increased if at the stage of policy design attention is given to potential problems of implementation. In order to avoid a considerable degree of failure in the implementation, they have offered 10 propositions that policy makers should ensure. First, circumstances external to the implementing agency do not impose crippling constraints. Second, adequate time and sufficient resources are made available to the program. Third, not only are there no constraints in terms of overall resources, but also that at each stage in the implementation process, the required combination of resources is actually available. Fourth, the policy to be implemented is based upon a valid theory of cause and effect. Fifth, the relationship between cause and effect is direct and there are few, if any, intervening links. Sixth, there is a single implementing agency that need not depend upon other agencies for success, or if other agencies must be involved, that the dependency relationships are minimal in number and importance. Seventh, there is a complete understanding of agreement upon the objectives to be achieved, and these conditions should persist throughout the implementation process. Eighth, in moving towards agreed objectives, it is possible to specify in complete detail and perfect sequence the tasks to be performed by each participant. Ninth, there is a perfect communication among and coordination of the various elements involved in the program. 10th, those in authority can demand and obtain perfect obedience. Thus, Hogwood and Gunn draw attention to the general neglect of the issue of policy implementation. For example, India's population policy of year 2000 lack an adequate policy design. Problems of policy design in this policy include ambiguous and ill-defined objectives, inappropriate measures to achieve the stated goals, and lack of political will and social support. These problems in policy design result from the nature of federalism and from symbolic politics that emphasize policy as an instrument to appease certain interest groups rather than policy which is designed to achieve intended outcomes. Some policies trigger bitter and open conflict, while others are agreeable to those who are making and implementing them. Lindblom in this context argues that the government decision process is often one of muddling through or of partition adjustment. Another conceptual problem in policy design relates to the lack of key regulatory principles in most public policies in India. It has been observed, for example, that most industries in the country have not come out strongly to comply with provisions of the Environment Protection Act 1986 and the Water Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1974. Industry management hesitates to comply with conditions imposed by the state pollution control boards, such as treating the effluents and discharging them in appropriate manner. Further, even when an industry installs a treatment plant, management may evade its operation in order to save the unproductive expenses of running the plant. Many industries often use various means to circumvent the provisions of law. Similarly, the National Water Policy adopted by the National Water Resources Council in 1987 was a good first step in the direction of evolving a national consensus, but it has largely remained unimplemented because of its poor design. The revised National Water Policy 2000, however, has addressed emerging issues with a national perspective. This also lacks a blueprint for action. Further, the subject of water is being dealt with the center in too many ministries. The solution for this is that the subject needs to be brought under one roof so that a holistic view can be taken of this precious resource. Next is policy analysis. Sophisticated contemporary economic analysis has permeated into policy formation and evaluation, especially in regard to physical projects such as dams, roads, power plants, and so on. Increasing number of planners and analysts promote the judgment of policies and programs on the basis of economic criterion. Not all policies or government agencies can be broken into small submits or analysis. Implementation of public policies in India has also been hampered by conceptual weakness in policy analysis capability. For example, National Health Policy of 1983 was adopted without examining alternative policy options. The inability to set priorities and strategies for reducing health had also resulted partly from the absence of policy analysis. Most of the state pollution control boards in India suffer from lack of professional staff, sufficient time and data. In addition, major policies have been adopted without much discussion over the policy alternatives, reflecting a strong adherence to secrecy within the bureaucracy. Referring to archaic criminal legal system, the first women officer of Indian Police Service remarked, "Our laws have never been known to keep pace with ground needs. We still have the Police Act of 1861, Prison Act of 1894 and the Indian Penal Code also of the same vintage. Our elected representatives accuse each other but do not legislate. They have failed us on this completely." Policy statement. Often policy statements announced by the government contain ambiguous and contradictory terms posing problems in implementation. The implementers at the field level often face a variety of problems because they do not find the policy statements made in clear words and terms. Policy Statement for Abatement of Pollution 1992, for example, stressed that the emphasis will be on clean technologies and not clean up technologies. The focus, therefore, must be on source reduction and substitution of chemicals with safe alternatives. Pressure of time. It is observed that the pressure of time creates an implementation gap. The time period fixed for according benefits as per the policy is not programmatic. Normally, while fixing the time frame, the policy formulators do not take into consideration the conditions prevailing. They become idealistic while setting the time targets and forget the workload at hand with the respective implementing agencies. Consequently, the head offices press the agencies for speedy implementation. The implementers under such conditions are unable to perform their duties properly and efficiently with regard to the said policy as well as other works at hand. Political problems. Political problems in the implementation of public policies are grave and complex. These hamper in securing effective implementation in the areas related to politics as discussed in the following sections. Lack of political support and political interference. Once a policy is formulated, there is no guarantee that it will be implemented, and often it is the case that the policy may not be implemented at all. This leads to what can be called implementation failure, the cause of which may be the lack of political support. For example, the National Population Policy 2000 has not been able to achieve its objectives owing to poor political commitment. In the implementation of policies, bureaucratic decisions often become political decisions. Employees are hired to appease one or other influential politicians. Contracts are awarded to relatives of big officials, or ex-officials become consultants as lucrative salaries. Involvement in such actions is for keeping active politicians happy. Centralized policy process. Frictions in the relationship between central and state governments have very often affected the policy implementation process adversely. In the area of environmental protection, for example, the policy process is heavily centralized. Policy decisions taken at the central level, including setting goals and procedures, ignore the local culture. It has also been observed that the central government was more than willing to adopt pollution, health, education and environment policies and programs, but when the time came for their implementation, state governments often lacked the political will to proceed. It is still questionable whether health or environmental quality has improved at all in terms of safe water, clean air and healthy living conditions. Policy makers at the central level increasingly realize that wide implementation gaps exist in several social policies. As a whole, the organizational structure for implementation of social policies is in a better shape at the central level than at the state level, especially in terms of finance, technical expertise and the rapport between various ministries. On the contrary, serious financial problems exist at the state level because of budgetary deficits. The financial problems increase the reluctance of the states to allocate resources for the implementation of public policies, especially in the areas of education, health, environment and population, which are perceived as non-productive investment. Flood-hit states during the months of July and August every year have to approach the central government for compensation, and central team is appointed to assess the loss due to the floods. Politicians both at the state and central levels often discuss short-term rather than long-term measures for flood control. The focus often is on ad hoc measures such as flood relief. Moreover, flood relief operations provide ample scope for politicians, public officials and contractors to indulge in black marketing, distribution of substandard materials and diversion of government funds. Thus, flood control policies are destined for a short life in that they deal with a problem that can be resolved. Apparently, there is lack of support from the organized interests for a permanent solution to the flood problem. Interest group politics. When a policy is made, its implementation is far from assured. The interest pressure fields are also to be found inside public organizations. Some groups may work to weaken implementation. Certain industries may place direct pressure on the bureaucracy to reverse a policy decision, or they may work from their end to weaken it. Within the bureaucracy, senior administrators may even support and uphold such actions. This is called the interest group politics. For example, several industries have little concern about the environmental consequences of sitting decisions, retrofitting old technology or introducing new technology. Industry influences the environmental policy implementation process through the business lobby and representatives of business interests. Pressures from industrial associations during consideration of Environmental Protection Act in the Parliament resulted in the weakening of the penalties for non-compliance and also forced the government to delay enforcement of the passed legislation. Because of low cost of non-compliance, industrial firms in both public and private sectors have had little incentive to comply with environmental regulations. At the same time, it is important to note that the labor unions have not taken any major initiatives for the control of pollution problems inside or outside the factories or for the safe use of hazardous facilities and machineries. Most industrialists in India are politically powerful. They have links with the ruling parties both in the central and state governments. In this way, the environment policy process continues to be influenced by vested interests. Apart from these, the policy implementers face many other problems and challenges. Every subsection of the society clamors for the protection of its interests. While doing so, the mobilized people go to any extent to safeguard their interests. The implementers are influenced, the process is distorted and distracted, and efforts are made to get the policies implemented in a way that suits the specific interests. One such is the case of implementation of National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. It was pointed out by the Chief Justice of India, Justice K.G. Balakrishnan, that the scheme was one of the most progressive welfare measures so far taken in the country, but unfortunately it was stopped halfway through its process by factors such as corruption, lack of transparency, and nexus between contractors and officials. Thus, the implementation process remains weak and tardy. Next is unification of bureaucracy. Another glaring implementation gap is the unionization of bureaucracy, especially the lower bureaucracy. This has destroyed not only the work culture and discipline, but also demoralized supervisory staff, which offers little resistance to the unionization pressure. The higher and the middle levels of bureaucracy are too powerless and marginalized to give any relief to citizens in case of corruption and unresponsiveness of the lower level staff at the cutting edge of administration. Further, endemic political interference by the political executive has compounded the marginalization of the higher bureaucracy, thereby undermining its capacity to implement public policies. Next is lack of public involvement. Public involvement in policy implementation programs such as education, health, population control, control of pollution, forest conservation puts tremendous pressure on the administrative staff to produce results. By staging demonstrations, protests, and mass movements, the public can largely offset the power base of vested interest groups and build a power structure of its own to implement policies. The Chipko movement in the Uttar Pradesh and now Uttarakhand hills and the Apiko movement in Western Ghats of Karnataka were launched against tree felling for commercial purposes. However, the public in India has provided a necessary clientele to the environmental protection. Bureaucracy, local movements against deforestation and construction of dams are sporadic in nature. Due to the limited resource base, poor knowledge and lack of political support, the people have not been enthusiastic in creating mass movements for implementing and enforcing public policies. Thus, in a developing country like India, most programs remain neglected for want of people mobilization and support. Moving from ideas and policy statements to implementation is essentially a complex process. Policy making does not end once a decision is reached. The implementation of a decision is just as important as the policy itself. No policy formulator can assume that decisions will automatically be implemented as envisioned. Policy implementation requires a wide variety of actions, including first, issuing policy directives that are clear and consistent. Second, creating organizational units and assigning personnel with the information and authority necessary to administer the policies. Third, coordinating personnel resources and expenditures to ensure benefits to target groups. Fourth, evaluating implementing actions of the personnel. None of these steps is necessary. The implementation of policy thus involves not the end of the policy making but a continuation of policy making by other means. In this process, innumerable factors could affect the policy implementation since it is inextricably a part of the governance. First, discuss the conceptual problems of public policy design and analysis. Second, explain the issues of political support and public involvement in policy design. Third, identify the role of leadership in solving problems of public policy.